When I began this book, I was somewhat burdened by the sense that I was obliged to answer those other volumes point for point, precisely and indefatigably. And so, as its composition proceeded, interrupted midway by the pandemic quarantine that settled over the world in 2020 and persisted for roughly a year and a half, it naturally began to assume the dimensions of yet another ponderous inventory of every variation ever worked on every bad idea in the field. Before I knew what I was doing, I was engaged in building a Tower of Babel, though one whose vertical aspirations were repeatedly being delayed by lateral additions of new wings and annexes to its base, the whole edifice scaffolded by an ever more intricate critical apparatus. Then I came to my senses. I may one day revive that version of my project in some form, if I am seized by a mood of giddy titanism, or should feel the piercing need to compile an archive of important documentation for the curious. Perhaps a series of short monographs on discrete aspects of the topic would work, or I may mercifully consign all of it to oblivion, where a great many gigantic academic texts should end up. For now, however, I have decided to confine myself to an exposition of my central argument, without performing the usual ritual of endless prelude. That still involves considerable expository work, but also allows for much of it to be done with attention only to the problem's general topography, so to speak. As I say, almost all of the solutions regularly proposed to the question of the origin and nature of mind are not really solutions at all, but rather mere reformulations of the question itself, restating it in ways that momentarily, but only momentarily, look like answers. And most of those proposals can be dismissed in principle without the need for a survey of every particular variant of their explanatory failures. If one realizes, for instance, that the supervenience theory of mental activity is essentially a recapitulation of the paradox it addresses, mistaken for a kind of clarification, then there is no need to lay out at length every individual iteration of its futility. If one discovers that reflective self-consciousness cannot be adequately explained by reference to some higher-order faculty or action of the brain, it does not matter in the end whether one prefers to call this faculty or action a perception or a thought. If one recognizes that all versions of functionalism depend upon a logical fallacy, and, in any event, provide no cogent explanations of mental experience, it is best to deal with the issue economically, and then to move on to more serious matters. Many of the more finely granular inquiries in Anglophone philosophy of mind do not really interest me. I should also admit, mostly because I am convinced they are intrinsically uninteresting. Many involve obviously inadjudiciable claims and propose distinctions that are not so much logical or empirical as semantic. I honour those who labour in those fields, I suppose, but I do not believe the harvest will ever come. If any of this sounds dismissive, that is certainly not my intention. Writing on these matters over a span of several years has given me a fine appreciation of how intractable their central mysteries are. Neither is any of this to say that there are not a great many interesting books and articles out there on the problem of mind of a very technical nature, which anyone truly interested in this matter might profitably consult. It is to say, however, that in many respects the nature of that problem is not nearly as difficult to understand as we often like to imagine it is, and that the reason it seems to be so is that we tend to approach it already needlessly burdened by